This is Jacob Gluck, our favorite biblical scholar. Hi, Jacob. I'd like to ask you about kosher and slaughter, why animals have to be slaughtered a certain way, etc.
Okay, good question. Slaughter. Laws of kashrut, more general, but specifically about slaughter. So let me try to address both. First of all, let me talk about the laws of kashrut. There are several elements to the law. There's certain animals that you can't eat, and then there is the concept of not eating nevela or treifa. Okay, nevela means an animal that died, a carcass. In other words, an animal that was not slaughtered, wasn't slaughtered by a human. And a treifa is an animal that was killed in a predatory attack by another animal. So essentially, nevela and treifa are both forms of death in which the animal was not deliberately slaughtered by a human. Now, the first thing that I want to note about this, is that nevela and treifa are probably not healthy to eat. Because if you see a carcass on the street, it's probably infected. Okay? Whether it's nevela or treifa. Either way, it's not
Bacteria.
It's not in your best interest. Exactly, it's bacteria. So it's not in your best interest to eat it. So insofar as it is deleterious to your health, it seems extremely likely that the origin of these rules are steeped in what's practical, right? Because the Torah is simply telling, hey, be sensible. Don't eat this. It's not. It's more. It does you more harm than good. Okay, so that's essentially what it's doing. So to go back to the original question, to the other major component of the laws of kashrut, which is certain animals that are categorically forbidden, such as a donkey or a vulture, right? Things like that. So why are those forbidden? In other words, what ill health is there in eating those? And I think that I don't think that there's ill health in there, but I think that what's happening is that the Torah is simply codifying the modus vivendi, the lifestyle that is de rigueur at the time. In other words, the Torah is not saying that you ought not to eat it. The Torah is saying, don't eat it. We don't eat it. Our society doesn't eat vultures. Why not? Because it's difficult to hunt a vulture. And the same thing applies to a donkey, right? Not a donkey. A donkey also, but a horse. Okay, a horse is a beast of burden. We use a horse to travel. We use a horse to carry loads. We don't use a horse or an ox for food. That's just not how our society works. So the Bible isn't being prescriptive as much as it is being descriptive, describing what the situation on the ground is, rather than instructing us what we ought to do or what we ought not to do. That's what seems to be the case. Now, let me segue into this question of shechita, of slaughter. So the question of slaughter, now why does it have to be slaughtered? And the answer is it doesn't have to be slaughtered. Slaughtering was simply, like I explained earlier, it was simply the method. If you wanted to eat a healthy animal, right? So the animal must not have died from natural.
Most practical ways to
most practical ways to take a knife and slit its throat.
It's the least painful.
No, not the least painful.
Oh, we don't care about
Nobody cared about that. It's not the least painful. It's the most practical method. Obviously, least painful is also most convenient for us. If the animal puts up a fight, and we have to grapple and wrestle with the animal in order to kill it, that doesn't work, right? So the most efficient and effective way to do this is by grabbing a knife and slaughtering. So there is nothing esoteric here. There's nothing sublime and unreasonable.
And when we interpret
it's simply a practical guidance. What do you do? How do you do it? And I'm up to fourthly already. But I want to also add that the rules of shechita are actually rabbinic. It's not in the Torah. If you look carefully in the Torah, it never says exactly how. And this is one of those famous things that I'm not sure if they consider it halacha l'Moshe Sinai or whatever, but it's something that the entire Masechta Chulin is not present. There is no allusion to any of that in the Bible. All it says in the Bible is that you should lizboach, right? But lizboach is a very generic term, and it's not necessarily circumscribed by a particular course of action. In other words, it doesn't necessarily say that the knife cannot be serrated, which is one of the rules of shechita in modern times. And so like I said, so as far as the Torah is concerned, it's simply codifying what is generally practiced, how it's generally practiced, what we eat, what we don't eat, and how we prepare and how we slaughter and prepare animals for food.
Where do the laws of shechita come from?
They're
Why?
Rabbinic.
Why? Yeah, I know, but why? Where is it?
Oh,
where did it get?
what drove it?
Prompted the rabbis to this?
This ties in with a more general question, which is how did Rabbinic Judaism evolve? Rabbinic Judaism tends to be legalistic, and in a legalistic.
I know how it evolved. They try to make sense of the Bible, but how do you make?
No,
why?
No, it's not
No?
that actually it. No.
Okay.
Because if you really try to make sense of the Bible, you won't find the shechita in the Bible. So that's actually
Exactly. So this is the only thing.
The Rabbinic movement is not trying to make sense of the Bible. The Rabbinic movement is trying to
Influence its time.
It's trying to instill a sense of order. It's a sense of Greek logic and order and predictability. Everything must be accounted for. The Mishnah is always concerned with the least likely of events. You always say, if this and this...
Theoretical possibilities.
If you have a cheresh who happens to be on this and there, very obscure and scenarios. So why is it? Why do they do that? Because that's the legalistic approach. The legalistic approach has to account for every possible scenario. And so, now I'm addressing like the overall movement, how Rabbinic Judaism evolved. But as far as Hilchos Shechita is concerned, it ties in with that because in Rabbinic movements, everything has to have a method. How do you do it? Like, what do you do? What can you not? And it's not enough, like for them, am I explaining myself well? What I mean by legalistic movement? See, a legalistic movement is likely to tell you, you cannot eat you cannot eat a fly, right? Who's likely to eat a fly? Who would even think about eating a fly? But for them, this is important because it's a possibility. Because everything that is an option, everything that is an alternative, needs to be accounted for. That's the rabbinic kind of legalistic approach. And so everything has to be exactly described the way it ought to be.
So wherever they came up with it,
obviously they saw in the Torah that you have to slaughter an animal. So
they didn't know how, so they interpreted it their own way.
So what they did is they asked, what does slaughter entail? And they took the typical description of slaughter and they codified it. This is how it has to be. That's how things.
Which is quite arbitrary if you think about it.
This is it's not exactly arbitrary because they're taking what's already.
Right. Okay, I see. So it's not arbitrary completely, but it's based on previous stuff and based on the entire structure making sense.
Right.
All right. Thank you very much, Jacob.
You're welcome.